Hello learners, welcome to this lecture, the sixth lecture in the NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. I ended the previous lecture with a brief reading of William Butler Yeats's poem The Lake Isle of Innisfree, and I briefly introduced a defining tension at the heart of the poem, the tension between a longing for a particular object, reality, a physical space, and a longing for a state of mind which is the real goal behind inhabiting a particular space. It is an unresolved tension because at some point the poet wishes to be in a particular place, but at another point the poet indicates that less than the space itself, it is a state of mind that the poet really longs for. It is this sense of longing for a state of mind, but giving the name of a particular space to that state of mind, which creates another problem and which many scholars have addressed in their response to this very famous poem. Irish novelist Flann O'Brien writes a journalistic piece in which they criticize a lot of aspects of the poem. And I'll read this quote at some length to give us all a sense of the contradiction in naming the poem after this island, Innisfree. O'Brien writes, "First of all, Innisfree must be Innisfree, from the Gaelic, or Heather Island. Heather is a pervasive parasitic shrub which will invade any territory it does not already occupy. That is why peasants are often reproved for setting fire to the heather. He, that is, the poet or Yeats, who is longing for Innisfree, he will have a job clearing his plot for his 9-bean rows. But he clearly knows nothing about beans. The broad bean, or Vicia faba, of these latitudes flourishes only on elevated ground and in cool temperatures. A gardening book says it is very nutritious, but is, however, a rather coarse food, difficult of digestion, and is chiefly used to feed horses. He, that is Yeats, knows nothing about bees either. A normal colony amounts to about 100,000 bees, most of them female and workers. It is true that heather yields honey, but it would have to be a very big lake isle to keep that crowd going, because bees will not cross water. Living alone on a sole diet of honey and horse beans seems unrealistic." And O'Brien goes on in this way. So the two things to note from this satirical account published in a very influential journalistic space is that Yeats is not really concerned with physical details. Yeats is concerned with Innisfree, but does not really care for what Innisfree really is. Yeats does not worry about aligning the forensic, agricultural, biological, scientific details of his imagined, dreamlike, fantasy-like scenario. Yeats has not thought through the feasibility of growing beans, the practicality of having a bee-loud glade, the practicality of growing and cultivating flora and fauna in the way that he imagines will give him peace. Yeats is longing for peace and provides a vision of how he believes he can achieve peace. Whether his fantasy or his imagination of the methods of achieving peace are feasible, one does not know, and Yeats, as a poet, does not care. So what does Yeats care about then, if not for these things? Yeats cares for the word Innisfree. And there is a contradiction here which is very telling. It is not a simple accident. As O'Brien writes, the Irish word Innisfree, or if Yeats had to call this island by an English word, he should not have used the word Innisfree. Rather, his choices, as O'Brien provides them, are two. One is the literal Gaelic word Innisfree, or the literal translation of Innisfree into English, which is Heather Island. Now, both of these choices Yeats rejects, Innisfree or Heather Island. Instead, Yeats goes for the word Innisfree. It is a hybrid word because it conveys something in English which is through the sound of an Irish place, and not the cognitive meanings of the Irish words. Yeats is not translating, Yeats is reproducing and recreating the emotional impact of the sounds of an Irish place's name in an English word. So, in some ways, it is a mistranslation if one looks at the facts. But it is not a mistranslation, it is rather a creative decision, a choice that a poet makes in order to convey some of the tensions, some of the ideas, the conflicts that the young man was going through. This contradiction has to do most literally with the difference between Irish and English. Yeats is conveying a very Irish reality using a very English word. This tension is replicated throughout the poem, particularly in the rhyme scheme of the poem. In terms of intellectual tensions, this choice also introduces for Yeats a tension between two ideas of freedom. Yeats as a poet asserts his freedom to call this Irish island by any word that he considers appropriate. That is creative freedom, poetic freedom. On the other hand, Yeats is also conveying a lack of freedom. He is trapped within this English disciplinary system. And the only freedom that he can strive for is not full freedom, but a reduced freedom, a freedom where he becomes free when he is left alone. Yeats wants to be left alone in order to fulfill his dream of freedom. It's a very different idea of freedom from what many politicians in contemporary Ireland and England were fighting for. The freedom for home rule, the freedom for political autonomy, the freedom to make decisions about who rules Ireland. These are not the freedoms that Yeats is describing and longing for in his poem. Instead, the freedom that Yeats is longing for is simply a freedom from everyone else, a freedom to be left alone in his imagined beloved glade, in his imagined island with its natural beauties, which Yeats has not even bothered to think through or get them fact-checked by a more agriculturally aware writer or source. So the poem, as I've been saying, is about freedom, is about two different kinds of freedom, which pull apart in contradictory directions. On one hand, there is a freedom from everything. This, as I've mentioned before, is a freedom that Yeats imagines he will have when he is left alone, when he leaves the grey pavement of London's Fleet Street and places himself in this island of Innisfree. This freedom from everything is opposed to a freedom to do something. This freedom to do something was referred to by a lot of public figures in Yeats's time, figures who cared deeply for Irish home rule, figures who opposed the Protestant or proxy British colonization of Ireland, figures like Parnell, figures like O'Leary. These were figures whom Yeats was very aware of, some very personally, but Yeats remained indifferent to these calls for very public, active forms of freedom. Instead, Yeats is drawn towards a more spiritual, a more passive, a more private form of freedom. Yeats therefore frustrates many readers in leaning towards a negative idea of freedom, a freedom from everything, not a freedom to do something. Now, the first literary reference which allows us to understand these contradictory ideas of freedom are referring to the Bible, specifically the book of Luke, chapter 15. This is the story of the prodigal son, and very specifically the words, "I will arise and go." In fact, this entire phrase comes verbatim from a particular text, the literary text, which is the King James Version translation of the Bible. Now, to briefly summarize the story, it's a story about a farmer who has two sons. The farmer lavishes a great deal of resources on the elder son. This elder son becomes quite profligate, squanders all of his resources which he has received out of love, and ends up in dire penury. This eldest son then is forced to go out and work in a different land. And there he realizes the folly of his ways. He is filled with regret and guilt that he squandered the resources that his father had lavished on him because he was the eldest son, because how much his father loved him, his eldest son. The resources he received out of love he had squandered. Filled with guilt, he decides to go back, to give up his current job and return to his father's farm. That is a brief summary of what happens in one part of the story. The story has other events, but we are concerned only with the thoughts and the regret of this elder son and the character who speaks these words, "I will arise and go." Yeats himself imagines that he was a prodigal son of sorts. He is regretting the mistake of his ways, the decisions he has made by choosing to study in London, England, by choosing to make a career in England. He is the prodigal son. Sligo, where he longs to go, becomes the home of his father, the home of his fathers, the native land of Irish people. There is a contradiction here, however. In the biblical story, the prodigal son returns to his father's land. As we have known from the family history of William Butler Yeats, Ireland is Yeats's father's land, but Sligo in particular is his mother's land. So while Yeats refers to the King James Version of the Bible and takes the words verbatim from this text, Yeats also complicates this inheritance by going back to his mother's land. Further, the other literary text that is referred to in the early stanza is the phrase "nine bean rows." These words come from Thoreau, from specifically Henry David Thoreau, the author of the autobiographical text Walden. Now, Walden is a classic of American literature. It's also a classic of environmental writing and eco-critical writing. It is one of the earliest articulations of the importance of nature. In it, Henry David Thoreau, a writer, philosopher, poet in 19th century America, decides that he is like a prodigal son. That is, he has squandered the resources that nature has given him. And he has been making a mistake that, like many in 19th century America, specifically 19th century Boston, Thoreau realizes that human beings have been exploiting nature, that the pursuit of modernity has come at the cost of deforestation, the exploitation of resources, and also the exploitation of fellow human beings. So Thoreau decides, like the prodigal son, to go back, to return to the space of nature, to return to a simpler life. This is what he does when he decides to live in a cottage by himself by the lake, which is Walden, by Walden Pond. So the desire to go and live by a lake, as Yeats experiences it, comes from his study of a very powerful literary text, which is about another writer who saw himself as a prodigal son and decided to return to a state of nature, which happened to be a cottage by Walden Pond. Now, there is a contradiction between these two forms of freedom. The reference to Thoreau, the desire to live like Thoreau in a cottage by Walden Pond, is an assertion of independence. Whereas the desire to be like the biblical prodigal son is not so much independence or distance from people, but rather a decision to go back to the land of one's own people. Now, the word Innisfree is also important. I briefly referred to the contradictions of this word, but the way in which Yeats uses the word Innisfree signifies not the heather that grows on this island, but rather the word for island in Ireland. That is to say, Innis is the Irish word for island, and freedom is an English word which connects and inherits British traditions of liberalism. The word free signifies a lot of British political economy and philosophical writing on the meaning of freedom. Most particularly, Thomas Hobbes and Jeremy Bentham write about the freedom of the liberal individual, which meant that the individual was protected by the government from other entities. That is, the individual was allowed to exist in an isolated, insulated sphere away from the influence of other individuals or groups. The freedom of political economy comes from this freedom. The subject of capitalist economics is the individual who has the freedom to sell or buy as he or she deems fit. Now, these are the ideas from British intellectual traditions which Yeats inherits and signifies in the word free. So, on one hand, the freedom of the Lake Isle of Innisfree is a freedom from London. That is, Yeats is homesick in London and wants to live in the Lake Isle. So he wants to be free from London. On the other hand, the word free signifies a form of freedom which lies not in any particular distance from a space. That is, the freedom lies not in terms of how far he is from London, but it is a function of ideas, feelings, and absolute lack of interruption from other groups and entities. So again, we are back at that contradiction. Freedom is both distance to and distance from particular places. That is, the farther Yeats is from London, the closer he is to Sligo, the freer Yeats's poet can be. That is one sense. The other sense is that freedom lies not in physical proximity or distance from places, but is a function of how one feels, how one thinks, and how free one's heart is. Now, let us focus a little bit on the form and the structure and the objective facts of the poem, how it conveys these ideas through its reality, its formal reality. Essentially, this is a poem about sounds, and we can isolate roughly two sets of sounds. The first is a set of assertive and declarative sounds. The best example of this assertive and declarative set of sounds is the phrase, "I will arise and go now." There is another set of sounds which are different from this, and these are quieter. These are descriptions of longing. These are relaxed descriptions of the place the poet longs for, the reasons he is longing for that place, as well as the reasons why such a longing might remain unfulfilled. These set of sounds are not assertive, but they exist in the form of an afterthought. They exist almost as a contrary thought. So the poet on one hand feels very confident and asserts that he will go and do things. This is one set of sounds. On the other hand, the poet also cannot shake off the sense that despite his confidence, despite his belief that he will do certain things and achieve certain states of mind, he cannot completely ignore the reality or the sense that he might fail and that he will remain in the state of longing but not really achieving the state of mind that he knows so well and he wants so badly. Now, let us focus a little bit on the rhyme and meter of the poem. All three stanzas have the same rhyme scheme, which is AB, AB. One example of this is the last words of the first stanza, which is Innisfree maid, honeybee glade. In addition to these standard AB-AB rhyme schemes, there is also an internal rhyme scheme which makes the poem very musical. There is a lot of cross rhyme, that is, the word dropping appears at the end of line 4 and the beginning of line 5. There is a great deal of alliteration, that is, the first consonants of words are repeated. Lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. lake lapping low, sounds in shore. So the L and the S sounds evoke a musical aspect of nature. What is that musical aspect? Just as the sound L is repeated, the water of a lake laps in a rhythm, in a periodic sing-song way against the shore. So the sound and the sense of the sentence combine and produce a musical quality. The last line has very powerful assonance, that is, repeated vowel sounds. And the last line actually is sort of a crowning glory in the intellectual progression of the ideas that the poem is conveying. The last line goes thus: I hear it in the deep heart's core. This line is quite assertive, and at the same time, it is quite diffuse and very passive, because while the sense of the words is assertive, the poet is describing a very sure sense that he has. On the other hand, the sense that these words convey, I hear it in the deep heart's core, say that he's not hearing the sounds literally, but rather he is feeling the sounds. It is a state of mind, again, not the actual island of Innisfree with his farm and his beans and his beehives. So the fact that he hears it, but deep inside his heart's core, not through more obvious and tangible senses. Now, the meter is actually also very important because the first 3 lines of each stanza are written in a hexameter with 6 stressed syllables. And you can pause the video and go back and read the poem aloud to get a sense of what these stressed syllables are. And these are iambs, which means that the first syllable is unstressed and the second syllable is stressed. So it is an iambic hexameter, first 3 lines of each stanza. The last line of every stanza, the 4th line of every stanza, however, is an iambic tetrameter. That is, it has 4 stressed syllables. Now, in a simplistic reading, this arrangement of syllables and stresses conveys that the first 3 lines describe a dream-like longing. They replicate the rhythm of tide, water, and nature. The last line, however, brings the poet and his readers back to the present. That is, he is in fact far from nature, is in a drab, urbane, and unhappy state of mind. And it is the desire for home in nature that is the most defining aspect of the poem. Not home itself, not nature itself, but the desire for home and the values attributed to nature, which the attribution of these values to nature is enabled deep inside a very unnatural setting, that is, grey pavements, Fleet Street, shop window, etc. So the defining sense of these stress patterns and the arrangement of 3 iambic hexameter lines followed by 1 iambic tetrameter line is to convey the poet's inability to get a state of happiness that he has been describing. A very sophisticated reading of this stress pattern can be found in the scholar Michael North's book, The Political Aesthetic of Yeats, Eliot and Pound, published in the year 1992. North has a reading of these 9 hexameter lines. And I'll briefly summarize North's claim to try and provide a very rich and powerful idea of how to appreciate this poem. Now, Yeats's hexameter is different from others like him. Like the Rhymers Club poets in London, poets like Ernest Dowson. Yeats's hexameter lines have 13 syllables, not 12. So there is an extra unstressed syllable in each of these 9 lines. Of these 9 lines, 7 lines have the extra unstressed syllable roughly in the middle of the sentence, and North calls it the medial caesura. These extra syllables are further located, and these extra syllables are actually given to 2 words. So in 3 of these 13-syllable hexameter lines, the unstressed syllable is the word there. And in 4 of these 13-syllable hexameter lines, the unstressed syllable is conveyed by the word now. So the word that is repeated in an unstressed syllable over these 12 lines is the phrase there now. So there now are the extra words that the poet adds to the expected conventional rhyme scheme of what the poem would be if it was written by the poets that Yeats was surrounded by and learning from. So if Yeats was simply a Rhymers Club poet, the word there now would be missing from the poem. So there now can be seen in Michael North's interpretation as the words that Yeats adds to the kind of poetry he saw was being written. There now is Yeats's way of becoming a modern poet while being inspired by Victorian poetry. There now is what Yeats says as a 20th century poet. In Michael North's words, the words there now, the two unstressed syllables, are like a sigh. They represent how the rhythm of each line contains a sigh, a lapse in the scansion of the poem, at which point the poet breathes pure longing. Now, pure longing is Michael North's interpretation of Lake Isle of Innisfree. What was this longing and how did Yeats himself describe it? To return to the autobiographical thoughts of Yeats on this poem, we will try to understand what was this longing and what was the creative intervention Yeats was able to make. Yeats writes, "Innisfree was my first poem with anything in its rhythm of my own music. I had begun to loosen rhythm as an escape from rhetoric, and from that emotion of the crowd that rhetoric brings. Escape from common rhythms is easy enough to understand. Yeats, as a poet, wants to stake his claim on new rhythm and does not simply want to repeat old rhythms. It also signifies not only an escape to a new voice, but an escape to a new and other geographical space. The political significance of unstressed words there now are the conversational equivalent of a strategically placed sigh. Imagine a conversation in which politically minded figures, aware of Ireland's fraught situation, describe a political strategy for Irish people to become more free. In this conversation, where different voices argue for strategies in which Irish people can experience more freedom, the poet William Butler Yeats makes an intervention, says something in response to these political arguments for Irish freedom. Yeats's response is not an argument, not a powerfully thought through or sophisticated idea or a political strategy. Rather, Yeats's response is a sigh. He sighs because he simply wants to be free. He wants to be free in a way that he was free in his memories of Sligo. He wants to be free in a way that poets in Victorian London have written about freedom. The Irish poet stuck in London therefore carves out a space for himself, his memories, in the middle of an English sentence, in the middle of an English style of writing a poem, which was measured according to English conventions. So we have now come to an end of this reading. I hope that this discussion of Yeats's strategies, memories, and background, as well as the contemporary relevance and connotations of the word Innisfree, as well as Yeats's memory of Sligo County, will be useful to all of you who attempt to understand and appreciate this very iconic and very moving poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree by William Butler Yeats. Thank you.